Hey, listener, it's me, zero-time all-star Trevor May from MCA Media, the ultimate destination for discussions about tech, gaming, content creation, and everything in between. I just wanted to pop in and let you know two very important things. One, you smell incredible today. Two, the May Contain Action Network now has an ever-expanding catalog of great shows, like the D&D-centric Forgotten Pass, Goblins and Growlers, and Quid Pro Roll, or the phenomenal Fortnite podcast Invaulted, hosted by Squatting Dog. Give them a listen, level up your podcast game, and have some fun. Shows are linked in the show notes.
Hey Goblins, Brandon here. If you enjoy what we do and you'd like to help support us create more and maybe even take the podcast to weekly, then the best way right now that you can support us is to head over to patreon.com/goblinsgrowlers. You can find all the different stuff we do there, one-page dungeons, bonus audio for things, all kinds of stuff. So head on over there, and even if it's just $1 or however much you're comfortable doing, or if you can't put anything toward the Patreon, just tell a friend about it. Tell somebody about the podcast. That's another great way to support us. So patreon.com/goblinsgrowlers, and we'll see y'all soon. Hey everybody, welcome to the Goblins and Growlers Podcast. I'm Brandon at Way of Brandalore, and you may see that that's not Josh if you're watching this on video, and pretty soon you're going to hear that it's not Josh. We have a special guest today, Noah Downs Esquire, noted tabletop attorney. Say hi to the people.
Hey people.
Yeah. Josh is sick right now with the illness of our time and is unable to record.
Would you say he's down with the sickness?
I don't think he's down with it at all.
So I think he can't get up.
No. I can't wait for him to hear this. Yeah, so Noah was kind enough to respond to my hail for somebody to fill in and chat, because he's always eager to have other platforms to promote various things he's doing, such as the Forgotten Paths podcast, which I've decided we're going to get the first plug for it out of the way early so we can have an uninterrupted conversation later.
Yeah, all right. So hey, buddy. Yeah, so good. Thank you for the plug. Thank you for the setup. Thrilled to be here. And if you are unfamiliar with the Forgotten Paths podcast, make sure you just pause, like real quick. Take a look at whatever podcatcher you're listening to, or if you're watching this, open up your phone. Like, go to Spotify, go to Apple, go to whatever you listen to it on, and download every episode of the Forgotten Paths podcast. One, because it super helps our analytics. And two, because you will love and enjoy it, and you'll just pick it up and be like, listen, I want to listen to some amazing D&D story, some amazing D&D role-playing, and you'll thoroughly enjoy it. 1 hour episodes. We've completed one entire campaign, did 6 miniseries, and now we're on campaign 2. So hope you enjoy it.
All right. So you kept it nice and succinct. Long gone are the days where you were walking around a convention with a whole sheaf of 8.5 by 11 papers that you clearly did at the business center at the hotel in Times New Roman, promoting Forgotten Paths and just leaving them in various tables around the place.
That's actually true. And as I've upgraded, and if you're watching, you can actually just look at this QR code and just scan it. And there you go.
Yeah, thanks. Taking audience away from me. Noah Downs Esquire, ladies and gentlemen.
Hey, I love you, Brandon. I love being here, man.
No, I love you too. Noah actually, he bailed me out in a couple of ways. Number one, by agreeing to be on here so we could record, because you may notice that we haven't had an episode in a couple of weeks, and that's largely just because life has been busy and then Josh got sick. So we needed to get back on track. So I'm thankful for Noah being able to help out there. And then I also did him the double anti-solid of saying hey, do you want to be on the podcast? Sure. Okay. What do you want to talk about? Because I need you to come with a topic as well. So this is why you have an attorney in your friend group. This is why you have somebody you pay to get you out of jams. And Noah is coming through. He's coming through for us. So I'm really just a facilitator here today.
Good. I love it, man. I can do my best Josh impression if you want me to try.
Yeah, I'd really actually love to hear that.
Yeah. Okay, hang on. Okay, Josh, shorter than me. Mentally acute, but sometimes a little spacey. All right, I'm almost there. And yeah, so what do you think about role playing, Brandon.
I think your hairline needs to move forward about 6 inches to be Josh, and you need
a
about
little blonder.
Yeah, it needs to be blonder, and you need at least 10 times the volume. You need exponentially more volume in your hair than you have right now.
Oh, I thought you meant volume with my voice. I'm like, I'm not.
No.
Yeah.
No, he's a fluffy boy.
Lift. Yeah, he's a fluffy boy. He's an esoteric boy.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, no, we all love our Josh. I can't do a Josh impression.
Yeah, I've heard him referred to by multiple people as the best golden retriever they've ever met.
Whew, that's accurate. Have you ever seen a golden retriever be pensive? That's Josh sometimes. Anyways, so
that's Josh when he's doing the company taxes.
Yeah. So what are we talking about today, man?
You wanted to talk about, if I check my text messages correctly, you said, hey, why don't we talk about role-playing spelled R-O-L-E versus role-playing R-O-L-L? Mm-hmm. And I thought that was good because that's something that I struggle with a lot. And, I don't necessarily struggle with it in myself of what type of player I want to be anymore. Sure. But it's just like seeing a lot of sort of mismatched tables with people who are spelling it differently.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing that I've always struggled with is when I started playing D&D, I was much more of a min-max or power player. You know what I mean? And where I was truly role playing as opposed to role playing. And it's the world's greatest tabletop role playing game when we refer to D&D. And then obviously we have other systems where its focus is less on the dice and the system build, but more on the role play. So some of the things that I think we could talk about today, and I think that we'll kind of run down the list of, is how does role playing versus role playing? We're gonna have to find a better way to distinguish those two.
Trill your R for one of them.
Role playing is when you
millions of Spanish speakers worldwide are cringing.
Yeah, I'm not trilling my R's. I'm gonna offend somebody. I don't want this podcast to be canceled after my fourth appearance. Anyway, so we want to talk about how each one affects your builds, how it affects your play, what resources you have when you're doing role playing as an improv role playing, and then resources you have when you want to do a min max role playing. Then talking about what is power gaming, what is min maxing, and then what is on the other side of that. How can you use role playing to maximize your storytelling and catharsis?
Yeah, and when we were having the text exchange trying to figure out how we wanted to handle this, one of the things I brought up, and I've had a chance to think about it more in like the ensuing hour from that exchange, but yeah. I like to think of tabletop existing on a spectrum from like war games at one end to collaborative storytelling all the way at the other end. And like, D&D and a lot of those like sort of similar systems in the segment sort of float sort of around the middle there. And I tend to look at ROLL versus ROLE as war games versus storytelling. Is really where you're at. And it's like, what kind of player do you want to be? How were you brought up in tabletop? What were you first introduced to? I think really influences that. I think it's a nurture thing more than anything.
Oh yeah, I totally understand that. I mean, obviously D&D came out of classic wargaming back in the 60s and 70s, truly the 70s. And that's what TSR comes from. So that's a perfect build. I do think, I just came up with it, by the way. Role play will refer to like ROLE, and dice play will refer to ROLL.
And if you're in either of those, if you have a mount with you or something, then it's pet play.
God. I'm not ready for that yet.
Yeah, sorry.
Anyways, so hey man, so let's talk about the difference. So what is role play?
Which one? Oh yeah, we said dice play is the other one. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I'm paying. I need my subtitles.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for the first thing it's a trust exercise. Yeah. Like that's one of the main differences is like if somebody's role playing, I think the biggest hurdle that a newer player has when they're sitting at a role playing table is the trust aspect of it. Because it involves making an ass of yourself. It involves pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. It involves controlling the way you're having interactions with people in a way that's unnatural. And you really have to be able to trust the people you're around when you do that kind of thing. Just because of human nature, nobody wants to be looked at as the fool, even if it's something that's desired at the time. And like, you have a theater background, so I'm sure you sort of know what I'm talking about there. Is like, you have to get over a hump when you're performing to be able to commit to the character. and the scene and everything going on around you, and not feel like you're being silly, you know? And I think that's the biggest problem a lot of people have really committing to role play, is that they can't take themselves, they can't just live in it. They sort of are watching themselves from outside be foolish, and it's making them cringe a little bit.
Yeah, it's getting into character. It's settling into the true play aspect of role playing games, and realizing that getting rid of the anxiety and the stage fright. Because even if you're just sitting around with your friends who you spend all your time with, or maybe you're with a new group, maybe you're on a podcast, for example, you're gonna have an element of stage fright because you're doing something. You're trying to be something other than yourself. You're trying to be another, and it's when the stakes feel mismatched. Is when you have that anxiety arise. So when I'm around a table eating Cheetos and rolling dice with my friends, but in game, your character is going through a dramatic loss. That mismatch of stakes is what leads to that anxiety, that stage fright of I'm going to look like an ass because I'm overreacting. And that is something that really, if you can settle into that feeling and settle into that acting effectively, it allows you to really role play and feel your character, to truly settle into your character. What a lot of people I see when they're role playing around a table, new people especially, is they emote more. And role playing isn't necessarily emoting. Role playing is being. It is showing the act of existence. And so one of the most salient pieces of advice I ever got, because like you pointed out, I was an actor before I was a lawyer. One of the most salient pieces of advice that I ever received was relax into the character, as opposed to trying to step into the character from behind. Your character is there. Relax into them, settle down like you would into an overstuffed couch, and just be, and then let that flow.
Yeah, I lost my train of thought.
Good.
I had a point I was going to make, and now I can't remember what it was, because this is great audio that I'm going to ask Scott to cut out.
Yeah.
When we get there, because you were talking about that, I was listening to it.
Settling into a character.
Yeah, settling into a character. I've lost it. I can't get it back.
You're good.
Scott, cut that out.
Don't cut out my part, Scott.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah, no, burn the whole forest down.
Done. So yeah, that's kind of where I think that a lot of people can start with their role-playing journey. And I think that's important because it opens up character interactions in a way that allow you to explore the world away from your dice.
I just remembered what I was going to say. So
Good.
Scott, you can keep all that stuff in now.
Good.
But what you were talking about like emoting and that not being really what you need to be doing there, that like it can be weird for everybody else at the table too. Like I remember it made me think of one instance that really stood out to me, and it was when we were running tabletop for a convention that I will not name publicly. But I think it was either the first or second year we were doing it, and I had somebody play at my table, and they clearly came from like an acting background, and I found out later that was true, but that was my suspicion at the beginning. And they were playing a bard, and they were basically doing sort of the stereotypical bard stuff. They were speaking in sort of a flowery faux Shakespearean kind of way, doing lots of gestures and things like that, and they weren't reading the table at all. No. And like it was a convention game, so everybody was there to just sort of hang out and have a good time. But I think just as you were saying all that stuff, it sort of clicked for me that the problem was like nobody would have felt weird if they were role playing their character, but they were emoting the character the entire time, and that just made it really awkward for everybody, because like I can't match that energy. Not when I'm not at a convention, when I'm running like 2 or 3 tables, like one after another in a day. Like I just don't have it in the tank. So it made it even worse because they were coming with this, and I respected that they were coming with it, but I'm sorry. I just cannot get there.
And that mismatch, that dichotomy is often when you do feel that weirdness at a table. Because honestly, all of us live for those moments where we realize a pin could drop right now when we'd hear it, because what's happening is riveting and we're feeling it. And that character that we've loved for 4 sessions is gone now. And we feel it. We feel a well of tears and emotion. And that's because we're role playing. Now, if someone goes into that and they force the tears and they choke back a sob that's not really there and it's not in the moment and they're not reading the table, then that's going to take everybody out of it. You know what I mean? And so that's where you get into don't stretch yourself on it. Just kind of play and be.
I always like to ask myself when I'm committing to something like that at the beginning of an outing, and let's just continue using tabletop as the example. Like,
sure,
I can bring this much energy right now. How much energy can I bring in 2 hours? How much energy can I bring in 3 hours? What is sustainable? Right. And I always like to say that when we first started doing Quid Pro Roll, when we were still doing some of like the pilot recordings to try to figure out exactly what we were doing, I really wanted to do sort of a Macho Man Randy Savage-esque voice. And I did that for maybe 15 minutes and was like, I really enjoy this, but this is unsustainable.
It is destroying my vocal cords.
Yeah. And like, I just can't keep it up. And that's what that kind of role playing turns into sometimes.
Yeah. And for me, like, one of the most cathartic role-playing experiences I've ever had was playing Sabishi on the Forgotten Pats podcast, which was like my DMPC, so to speak.
I think I'm going to put a little counter up in the corner.
You actually should.
Yeah, every time. Yeah.
You really should. But playing Sabishi, I was able to like play with my characters, and they grew to welcome Sabishi as one of their own. I've had a similar experience with the new DMPC in Campaign 2, which is set 100 years later. That is Rabbit, the bartender. And what I've always found is that whenever I try and do just too much with Rabbit is when Rabbit gets weird. And you can actually tell there's like one spot in Campaign 2 where like I just fell out of Rabbit completely. It's because I was trying to do too much. I was trying to affect my players rather than role play with them.
You seem like you had a point that you were going to carry on with there. So that's why I didn't start talking.
That was good. Good.
You ended on an ellipsis. So I wasn't sure.
No. And so one of the things that I did, it's probably because I was actually thinking about, okay, we've talked about role playing. Now, what about dice playing, the ROLL playing? And dice playing can also be incredibly fun. I'm not here to say like, we do role play versus role play. And, one is superior because we're actors, you know what I mean? But dice play can also be really fun, especially for chill pickup games, like especially with what Goblins and Growlers does, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I don't I'm glad Josh isn't here because I'm going to say something that,
good.
Yeah. I have longtime listeners will know that I have sort of a longtime hatred for dice pool games that get really kind of nuts. And I'm looking at you, Star Wars role-playing game with like the 8 to 10 to 12 different kinds of dice that you need. And you need like a pickup truck to bring them all to your game.
A Dice Goblin's wet dream.
Yeah, basically. And I think like it gets in the way of story a lot, I think. Sure. So I really don't enjoy having to deal with like throwing all the dice out there and then grouping them up and then figuring out what cancels out what and everything before you finally arrive at what you're doing. But that can also be really fun. Right. Like, it becomes much more of sort of a bingo game or a lottery game kind of than just rolling your D20 and adding a number because you're like, okay, well, all right. So my force dice came up like this. This is looking really good. But then you bomb out completely on all your other dice. So then everything cancels out. My main issue is that I just think Star Wars went too far with it. Yeah. With the Fantasy Flight Games version with like all the different kinds of dice. I think if you had like 2 or 3, it would be a lot more fun. But I do think it adds sort of like that kind of like gambling or randomness element to it if you focus on that kind of game a little bit more. But then, of course, you have people butting heads between the folks who are trying to role play their way through it and the people who are trying to dice play their way through it. And it's like, well, but I rolled a 20. Like,
Yeah.
and like
I should be able to do whatever I want.
Exactly. And that's where dice play becomes a problem, much in the same way that like not being able to regulate your energy and not inhabiting the character in role play. In dice play, this kind of entitlement that comes from the numbers on the dice.
Yeah, I mean, what I found is that when it comes to dice play versus role play, is it really depends on who I'm with and where I am.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm in a long-term campaign, such as Forgotten Paths, or at a convention, or playing with my homebrew,
I thought you were about to say playing with my homeboys.
Playing with my homeboys. Yeah. I mean, that's literally true. Like playing with my homeboys. Like if I'm on the podcast or playing with my homies, then I would say that role play is what I'm aiming for, because I'm looking to create a shared experience. I want to be cerebral. I want to be above the table with them, focusing on my interactions with them and socializing. If I'm at a convention, at a G&G event, if I am running a table professionally or something like that, and it's a 1-shot or a 5-shot, but I know that there's going to be a beginning, middle, and end, and I'm throwing them with strangers, I'm very much more on the table, which is where dice play takes place. And so being able to rely on the sheet and being able to do cool things with the character that I've built, it becomes the focus there. Whereas being able to do more with the character story that I've built in role playing is more on the other side. So what I really view it as is that role playing is above table. Role playing is interpersonal. Dice play is on the table. So it really depends on where you want to be playing and what the focus is for you. And it doesn't mean that you are one or the other, because you can have different needs for the other, like at different times.
Yeah, you can have, and it's different needs and it's different experiences too.
Right.
Because like if you talk to somebody who started playing in like 4th edition or something like that, almost I think to the person, they're going to be primarily dice players, because that's just what that build of the game was designed around. And that's why you have players in 5th edition now who, they'll roll their attack, they'll do their attack, but then they'll be like, okay, but I also have this that gives me this, and then I can do this for my bonus action, and then I'm going to spend a point and be able to do this as well. And it just keeps stacking and stacking and stacking, because what they're doing the tabletop equivalent of combos from a video game. Yeah. And I think a lot of dice play players like probably wouldn't like necessarily playing with me, because, and that's not to say I don't like playing with them or I think it's necessarily a mismatch, but just I have started moving more and more away from the dice as a GM. Like, agreed. I say all the time, I say like, I don't really use stat blocks anymore. I have one stat block. It is for a bear, and it is the one in the player's handbook. And I use it as sort of my base, my undifferentiated cell of an enemy encounter. And then just depending on what level the players are at and the narrative flow of the battle, I adjust things on there. Like obviously I got to lock into AC or something on it, which I usually do as like based on whatever level everybody is supposed to be at, like what's reasonable for that. But I personally think that is a much like doing that kind of storytelling combat with the dice as more of like a spice or a seasoning to it is much more fun and rewarding for the players, rather than letting the dice drive all of it. Because maybe like it's one of those situations where you've crafted this really great sort of BBEG level encounter, and you didn't account for the 1 or 2 things that some of the folks in your party at level 13 or 14 or 15 might have going on. And the whole thing just completely shits the bed. Nobody feels good about that. Like nobody, like maybe the players momentarily will be like, oh, that's awesome. We really got one over on you because you didn't plan that encounter well, or you didn't know exactly what this was, right? But when you go to look back on those moments, when you go to think about all the fun you had in your campaign and you reach the climax of it, and you just had this sort of like weak ending for it, the GM's not happy because they weren't able to give you a great experience. And the players ultimately, I think, are going to sort of regret that they built everything up to this one moment and it all fell apart. And granted, this is all sort of a hypothetical example, but I guarantee you this has happened many times in the last 50 years, right? So I just sort of read the battle, and I make sure everybody gets a chance to get something in. I make sure there's always some kind of peril or something going on there, so nobody really feels like it's a given. I try to avoid making sure somebody gets TPK'd or somebody gets killed or a TPK or anything, because I want to make sure everybody has a chance to participate. If somebody's going to get killed in the battle, I want to make sure it's after they've been able to do something.
It's got to mean something
that really makes it feel like they've given to this and they're a key part of the equation that leads to the victory.
Yeah, I would say much in the same vein. Like I love being able to live above the table when it comes to my combat encounters. In which, when it comes to combat is so inherently anchored by the dice play that we do. Your players can't escape the dice when it comes to combat. It is an inherent part of how that works, which is why a lot of people do complain about D&D 5e's combat. I come more from the D&D 3.5 builds and building those in, because I actually felt like while there was a lot of skill and a lot of stuff that went into min-maxing your rogue, for example, because they were your skill monkeys, I would say that it also allowed for a lot more roleplay experiences than 5e kind of does right now. I love being able to adjust on the fly. I love being able to say, hey, listen, we might have only done one round for everybody, but everybody feels like this was a good fight. Like, it's a big, bad, evil guy. You think that we're going to go 12 rounds with this thing. But one, if you're on a podcast, narratively, that's not fun to listen to. Right. And two, if you're at a table doing a fight for 3 hours, can really take you out of it. It's exhausting.
I don't know if I've ever told you this before, but this was like pre-Critical Role when it was right when D&D.
There was a time before Critical Role.
Believe it or not, yes.
Weird.
Like far back. I think what I'm talking about was recorded on a wax cylinder. It was that long ago. but it was right before tabletop podcast really broke out, and I had found one that was getting done like weekly, and I listened to it for like a year and a half, and then at a certain point I just had to quit because they spent one whole episode that was like 2.5 hours long in a combat.
Oh no.
And it was just so boring. And then they followed it up not too long after that with an episode that was 2 hours of them just sort of standing somewhere trying to make a decision about something and having philosophical arguments about it, which can be entertaining if you treat it the right way. But they weren't, because they weren't like trying to produce a professional thing. They were just trying to put a podcast. Their home game. Yeah, put a podcast out there. And it really soured me on the medium for a long time. And it wasn't until somebody I was dating years ago turned me on to the McElroy's podcast.
I'm a bit. Yeah, the Taz Balance was amazing.
Yeah, and so then I started listening to Adventure Time, or not Adventure Time.
Adventure Zone?
Yes, Adventure Zone. I started listening to that. And side note, very funny, I had no idea who the McElroys were before she turned me on to this. And I was listening to one of the episodes, and they start talking about like Jolly Pirate Donuts and stuff. I was like, wait a minute. And like, cause like I went to college where they're from. Yeah. And I was actually in school, like at the same time. I didn't know him with Justin.
That's cool.
Yeah.
No, I mean, like that's the thing is when I'm recording for Forgotten Pats, there's your counter again. I'm almost kind of doing it on purpose at this point. When I'm recording there, if I get a 20-minute combat, I'm starting to sweat because I don't want my audience to necessarily be listening to that. That is too much. What I really love about how role playing has evolved over dice playing in combat is that you get those moments where it feels dynamic, it feels moving, and rule of cool definitely does take precedence at times, and you have that ability. Now, if you're dice playing around with a lot of friends, you can do a 3-hour combat. That's fine. That's what you do that day, and that's what you're doing. We're fighting Tiamat today. You know what I mean? And so it really depends on the context and setting that you're in. Now, what's interesting is what I think is super weird to think about is if you're at a table where half the people have built their characters in a min-max way, which is typically dealing with dice play, and half their people have built their characters based on backstory and interactions, and this is not going to help me in combat, but this is going to help me, find the killer, so to speak, be the investigator.
Yeah.
They're focusing more on role play. And what happens when you have a party that builds their characters two different ways, I think, is typically you end up with an unsatisfied experience. Which is why I think it's really important for a GM, is even if it might not be good for the party's makeup necessarily, to say, we're going to focus more on one or the other this time.
Yeah. Almost like sort of a session 0 conversation you have to have at the beginning of each, right? And like ideally too, if you're, and it's always funny. Like I talk about every time we do like a Help My Game is on Fire panel, like the answer to the question 99% of times is you need to communicate with the people at your table more, right? And it's always like, oh, that should have come up in a session 0. And realistically, that's also that's a tone you need to be setting before anybody even sits down to play the first session. It's like, hey, as a GM, here's how I like to do things. I'd love to find out like how you all like to play, and we can determine really if this is a good fit. To make sure everybody's having fun. I've heard I had somebody say once that bad D&D is better than no D&D, but that's absolutely wrong. 1,000% wrong.
That's very wrong.
But like everybody's bad D&D is a different kind of D&D, right? And if I'm the role player and I'm sitting at a table full of dice players, there might be nothing wrong with these people. They might be great people, but it's not the kind of game I want to play, and that makes it bad D&D for me. So everybody has to get on the same page about that up front. And then maybe that's also where the GM talks about like, hey, I'm going to try to accommodate everybody. So like, if you don't feel it's really hitting on cylinders for you this time, like I'm trying to keep track of all this stuff. So like, let me know, be like, hey, could we have some role play elements next time? Because this was a big combat session. Like there has to be that kind of back and forth, I think. And I'm trying not to go off on a rant, but I think very often too much of the onus for fun is placed on the GM.
Right.
And players are complicit in it because it's easier for them, because all they have to do is show up with a character sheet and their dice bag and they're good to go. And the GM, I think sometimes, whether because of ego or just because of like utility, like this is how it's supposed to be, they're like, well, this is my story and I have to tell it this way, but it's not your story. Like I don't enjoy the Star Wars sequels all that much, but I also don't think anybody who does enjoy them is stupid, because they weren't made for me, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, so I feel kind of the same way about as a GM. Like you take a story and you put it out there into the world, it doesn't become your story anymore. And it's like George Lucas with Star Wars, like from what I've read, he was also unhappy with the sequel trilogy, right? But he sold the rights to Star Wars, so he doesn't get to say a say in that anymore. And I also don't agree with him when he gets mad at people who criticize the prequels that he wrote, right? I'm like, well, like, dude, that's, if you're gonna put something out there, like one of the things you just have to accept is that some people may not like it, and you don't have to agree with them. But I think listening to them may not be the worst thing in the world, just because maybe they have a perspective that they're bringing to it that just was outside of your experience. And that's bringing it back to what we were talking about, which is like, I could be the greatest storyteller on earth, but it doesn't matter if I've got somebody who's built a fighter who really wants to fight. Yeah. And like, I'm not setting up any combat encounters. Like, they need to be like, hey, I really enjoy your story. I would just like to be able to play more of a part in it.
Yeah, it's like when Hulk wants to smash, Hulk has to smash.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I think that there's a world in which you can accommodate both at the same table if you have the conversation ahead of time and you do maintain an open perspective on it. Yeah. And you know, I think that people who prefer, like, you can tell probably from this conversation, anybody watching and listening, Brandon and I prefer role playing as opposed to dice playing. I started off as a dice player, and I still love using the resources that I built for dice playing when I'm making a character, because now I've built out my role playing repertoire and done that enough where I can do both, and it's fun and crazy. And I do think that there's a world in which you can have both, and I think that if you are someone who says, I prefer role playing, well, try dice playing. If you prefer dice playing, give role playing a shot. It's, you know, it might not be for everyone, but you don't know until you try. That's why I always tell people, like, download Forgotten Paths, because you don't know if you're gonna like it until you try episode 1.
I'm gonna have Scott just make it ding every time you mention it, so even people listening to the audio get the full effect.
That's amazing. I love it. So let's talk about some resources for role playing versus dice playing.
Some resources for dice playing include the TI-83 graphing calculator.
I Actually, I was thinking that's true. I was thinking more. Obviously, everybody should read the PHP. If you haven't read the PHP Player's Handbook, go to your local shop, buy it. Alpha Comics, do it. But like in terms of digital resources for role players, you can find a lot out there. What I would do is I would check out like if you're playing in the Forgotten Realms wiki, learning a little bit more about the lore of the world, getting a feel for the setting, so to speak. So you kind of know, hey, this is the ethos and this is the place that we're living in. Talking to your GM about your backstory, more outside of just a session zero, saying, hey, this is something that I've come up with. Don't give them a 50-page manifesto, please. Yeah. Write it on your own if you want.
Yeah.
But say, this is something cool that I'd like to try and work in. If it doesn't, that's fine. But give them that, we can talk about knife theory in just a second, but give them that stick with which to hit you. On the role-playing, on the dice-playing side, I'll be honest, RPG Bot is like the best. I love when I want to min-max a character, I go to rpgbot.com. And I min-max the ever-loving shit out of some characters. I like whenever I'm doing a charity campaign and somebody says, "Hey, I don't have time to make a character for the stream. Can you create a character for me?" I'm like, "Oh, can I?" And then I go to RPG Bot. I just build the min-maxiest motherfucking shit that I can ever find. It is so much fun to like just look at all the synergies there. There are a few folks out there that like to, look at D&D shorts. Sometimes those aren't necessarily rule accurate. We'll put it that way, but people point there as well. And, I think that there's a lot of resources, but that's kind of where I look as RPG Bot's my go-to.
Yeah. I was going to take it in a little bit more of sort of a mathematical direction. Like,
sure.
If you're really going to be focusing on your dice play, I think one of the coolest things that you can look at is the probability tables for all the dice combinations.
That's true.
Yeah. Like you start looking at that and you start looking at what sort of the standard deviations are on your chances of rolling X versus Y versus Z, and, get it all put together on like an 8.5 by 11 where you can look and see what are my chances rolling these 2d6 of hitting this. And it's especially cool when you get into like, multiple D20 kind of things as well, and seeing what that looks like, because it really helps you. And maybe this takes you out of the world a little bit, but I think if you're dice playing, you're already a little bit out of the world since you're playing it more as in third person rather than first person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And just getting an idea of what your probabilities of success and failure actually are in those kind of situations. I think that's really fun, because it really kind of makes it more like gambling, which I'm not saying is fun. But
I heard that you're saying it's fun.
Yeah. I like to have an idea of my chances when I go into something, so I can know whether or not I was lucky or not.
It's the reason why, if you're doing a min-max character, if you're doing dice play, you will always take a 2d4 over 1d10 every time. Because you're gonna more than likely you're gonna hit 2 2s, 2 3s, 2 4s than you are to hit, in the 4 6 8.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Exactly. But yeah, that's just because I don't do a lot of dice play really in the way I play anymore. I don't sit and think about ways to improve my dice play experience.
Right.
But that is definitely one of them, where it's just like know your probabilities and try and think about ways that you can maximize them.
Yeah, and honestly, I would say if you're gonna do more dice play, Reddit's actually your friend, because Reddit people, they'll say, "Oh, I built this coffee lock and it's amazing," and then you can go through, and that's also an exercise in learning more about the mechanics of the game. Is this person full of shit, or can you actually do 15 Eldritch Blasts in one turn? You know what I mean? And so I would definitely take a look at some of that stuff. That's a lot of fun.
Yeah, my favorite, bringing it back to like combos, like my favorite examples of dice players are ones who make it look like they're playing like they're Eddie Gordo in Tekken, just hitting like a 20 kick and punch combination, doing capoeira, and just completely destroying somebody in like one turn.
You just absolutely stun locking somebody.
Yeah, pretty much.
I'll never forget. I was playing. It was like literally the first session with this crew, and I built this absolutely broken bow rogue. And I was like tabaxi, bow rogue, had some really great rolls when I was setting up the abilities. I min-maxed the ever-loving shit out of it because I knew that this crew was only going to play once and they never schedule again. So I wanted to have as much fun as I possibly could.
Yeah.
So the character, basically the city got overwhelmed, and that was like the big event to kick everything off. And my character just like stood on top of a building and just like destroyed everybody. So like I would say, if you can, do it once. Check it out. Become a supernova for a minute. Burn bright. You know what I mean?
So we were at Too Many Games in Philadelphia a couple weeks ago, and we're sitting there at the booth, and people are just coming up to us to talk about their games and stuff like that. And I ended up talking to this one guy, and we were just chatting about character builds and things like that. And he was I mentioned that I play a lot of Skyrim these days, and we got to talking about Skyrim. He's like, yeah, I've been playing a stealth archer lately. And then I stopped him and I said, are you familiar with the evolutionary term carcination? And he said, yeah. And he immediately knew where I was going when I said that. It's like, it does not matter what you start playing Skyrim as.
Everything turns into a stealth archer.
Evolution will direct you down that path, and everything evolves into it.
I tried to do anything but a stealth archer in Skyrim, and every time, like, it's usually about 10 minutes in, I change my mind. Like, it's just the game's designed to put you that way. So I mean, and so like I think that in D&D you have certain classes that people love because they're quote unquote broken. Like people say the bard's broken, or like
Mystic.
the rogue. Yeah, exactly. And so I think you can play those characters, but you can also role play them. You know what I mean? You can be super effective in combat, but also have an interesting backstory. And that's where we kind of merge both of these together, which is if you're good at both, you're going to be a force to be reckoned with, and people are going to want to play with you. And if you're good at both dice play and role play, you're the GM. And you're stuck there.
Yeah, it's that uniting of left brain and right brain.
Yeah,
it's the Nobel physicist who's also won a Grammy Award.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's Donald Glover. Like, can't be bad at anything. You know what I mean? Like, so but yeah, that's kind of where the inevitable try both ends up is oh yeah, you love it, and then you start writing your own stuff. Because the elements you love about your role play become things that you can then be like, oh, but what if I built this character and did this? Well, let's do this backstory. Suddenly you've built a sandbox for your friends to play into.
Yeah, another like role play resource that I've always enjoyed over the decades, because I've been playing for a little over 25 years, and one of the things that really helped me was essentially lots of trash fantasy fiction. I was
about to say books.
Yeah, no, it's a very specific subset of books because in the fantasy literature realm, you've got sort of your classics, like you've got your Beowulf and such. Then you've got your modern classics like Loader,
right?
And then there's basically everything else.
Yeah,
and there's such a large subset of everything else that is basically somebody took their D&D campaign and novelized it. And probably one of my favorites, it started coming out, I think, it would have been in the 80s, I think, that it started coming out. But it's called The Rift War, and it's by this writer, Raymond Feist. And there's like 25 books in that entire cycle that span like 200 years.
Starts Magician Apprentice, Magician Master. I literally have
Darkness
all of them.
Darkness at Sethanon. Yeah.
So good.
So I read like 20 of the books in that over the course of like 15 years. And the guy who wrote it, the thing is, like, it is set in the past of the 500 years in the past of the D&D world that he and his buddies played in college. And I enjoy it because it doesn't pretend to be something that it's not. It has no pretensions to be literature. It is not regarded by anybody as literature, because I don't think even Tolkien had pretensions of literature when he was writing. He just wanted to tell a good story. It is like your Harlequin romance of fantasy books, and that's not to take anything away from it. But it's just very good, very workmanlike, and it just sort of creates a lot of good archetypes that aren't over the top for these kind of things. And I think over the top is the issue there, because so many people lean into it so far that they're like, they're falling over. And you don't need to go that far.
The character of Pug in that series is an amazing level 0 to level 20 story.
Mm-hmm.
And it truly is what it is. Another example of a really good series, now that we're on the topic of books, because now that's where we're at now.
Yeah.
Like, hi guys.
Yeah.
Is the author that created Drizzt Do'Urden, Ari Salvatore.
Yeah.
Created the Crimson Shadow trilogy, which is incredible. It's an amazing trilogy that is, if you are somebody that at your table, people say that you have main character syndrome, you'll love it because it shows you how ridiculous main character syndrome can get. It's effectively, I think Ari Salvatore, I don't want to fuck it up, so it's one of those, basically took his D&D game in which he annoyed all of his friends by being the main character. And you can see where like other people created cool characters around him, and he was just like, no, you're supporting me now. And he went full on role play, but like to a dickish level. You should check it out. It's called the Crimson Shadow series. And the main character is a character named Luthien. And there's actually a character in that series that I've based a lot of my characters on, named Oliver de Burrows, who is a halfling thief. So obviously it works out. So
another one that I like that's more sort of on the stupid end of stuff is, have you ever read the Wizard and Rhyme series?
No, I hadn't even heard of it.
It's by Christopher Stasheff. There are like 6 or 7 books in the series, I think. But the premise is it's an English literature PhD student who gets like sent back in time to sort of this like alternate reality medieval Europe. And he discovers that like poetry and literature has the same effect, has the effect of magic and casting spells. So like he'll be in a situation and he has to like figure out how to get out of it. So he'll like think and he'll be like, and then he'll just throw out a Shakespearean sonnet or something that's vaguely related to the situation that he's in.
I love that.
And it'll just sort of weave the world around it, and he'll be able to figure it out. And it also gets like, that's ridiculous from the jump, but it gets even more ridiculous where it starts going all Eric Flint, because he's like trying to institute like modern things in this medieval world. Like he creates like the university system there. It's been a long time since I've read it. So but just like the 1632 series, but dialed back a little bit.
So what we're saying is if you want to, if you're like, man, I could really role play a little bit more, read a book. Like when your next D&D session is inevitably canceled. Yeah. pick up one of these books somewhere and read it.
Here's the thing. Here's the specific thing about that I'm saying, though, like, don't sit down and read Midsummer's Night's Dream.
No, it's not going to help.
Don't read 1001 Arabian Nights. Find some just blue collar fantasy garbage and just start tearing through it.
What we should do is when this episode is published, we should post some of our recommendations in the QPR Discord or the G&G Discord. Yeah. And I think that would be a great thing to do just in case people want to listen to them.
Yeah. And also, like, if you're listening or watching this right now, like, post in the comments.
Absolutely. Yeah, please.
Absolutely.
Please. And I'll be honest, another way to kind of get around to learning some more role play and trying to find the difference between role play and pacing, especially when it comes to role play, dice play, and your table, is to listen to podcasts. So listening to QPR, listening to Forgotten Paths, listening to Taz Balance, because then you'll hear some of the pros do it. And the people that I put at my table, Forgotten Paths, I'm not a pro, but they are. So you should definitely listen to those, because that'll help you kind of see what we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm looking at your notes here, and I think maybe the only thing that we haven't hit on yet is you were talking about storytelling and catharsis a little bit there. So I want to make sure we hit that.
Yeah, so the reason I put down storytelling and catharsis on our show notes for today is because I am, at the end of the day, role-playing is my preference over dice play. Because at the end of the day, the dice are going to inform where we go, and the dice are going to inform what happens and how we get there. But the dice only has meaning based on how we react to what happens. You roll a nat 1. Okay, you don't get to pick that door. But how does that affect you?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, what does your character do? Like, they don't just stand there. Like in real life, if we roll a nat 1 in real life, that causes emotion. That causes reaction. That causes us to find another way around. That causes us to doubt ourselves, etc. Something like that. So rolling that nat 1, think about it. It's much more interesting to roll a nat 1 than roll a nat 20. But if you've rolled a series of nat 1s, when you roll that nat 20, it's that much sweeter. And so figuring out who your character is through role playing will increase the catharsis you do get from your dice play. Because at the end of the day, it's the world's greatest role playing game. And it's not because we like doing math. We hate math. Like all my homies hate math. But if you are dice playing and you have the ability to react to the dice, that's role playing. And so if you are a good role player, you'll be a better D&D player overall.
You know, you said something there that made me think of something else when you were talking about like finding your character through the dice and stuff, right? Like that brings me up to another point. Like earlier when you were talking about folks who create their characters and they write like these little 50-page tomes about like, this is everything about my character. And as loath as I am to give you an opening to talk about Amnesia campaigns and Forgotten Past Season 1, I'm going to say like, I really think that's not the best way to approach play.
Right.
Because part of the, part of the quote unquote fun about life is moving through it and discovering things about your world and yourself at the same time. Right. So I think you do yourself a disservice when you go into a game planning to role play and you've built out just sort of every facet of your character. You need to leave some things there for discovery. You need to figure out what your character, you organically figure out what your character doesn't like, what your character does like. It's like when you talk, when you hear like interviews with actors who've been acting for decades, right? And they talk about how they discover the characters and they give all their insights to the characters. Like, I didn't know this when I started playing this person, but it turns out they actually hate this. And here's why. Now you're not going to find that anywhere in the script, but that's something that just helps motivate me and guide me as sort of a North Star as I play that character. And I don't think you can be I don't think you can walk into a character knowing those things for anything. You have to, it's a process of self-discovery. And I think when you're role playing, you have to keep that in mind. Nobody comes into the world fully formed.
Exactly. And think about it this way. I think one of the most interesting characters all the most interesting characters that you love didn't start their story with a 50-page backstory. We don't know who Samwise Gamgee is before we open, the Lord of the Rings. Now, when Samwise takes one step further than he's ever taken before, that's interesting. I learned something about him then. Then he goes on to become the only mortal to ever wound Shelob. You can't write that into a backstory. Like you inherently have to you have to be open to discovering who your character is. That's honestly one of the reasons why I do love Forgotten Pats. And this is not me memeing to get a counterpoint. Is because the players that we have and why we do Amnesia campaigns is it allows them to discover their characters as we go. Their character sheets are completely empty. And it doesn't matter who their backstory is. And in fact, as they discover their backstory, it's incredibly interesting to see where they're different. And like how the world that they've interacted with since they forgot who they were has changed them. And it really shows that how does that affect somebody to realize, oh, I did this. I would never do this now, knowing who I am now and the company that I keep.
Knights of the Old Republic.
Yes.
Think about the twist in Knights of the Old Republic.
Yes.
That if you had gone into that game knowing who you were, it would have meant nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah. But through the process of discovery, it's probably one of the greatest twists
of all time.
Yeah. Well, like in terms of Star Wars canon, there's probably I'm your father.
I was about to say I'm your father's figure.
And then there's that. For Star Wars canon. But the timeline of anybody's life is you're born, stuff happens, and you die. It's never I'm right here, stuff happened in the past, and now I'm going to move forward.
And Yeah, and that's the thing is you need to leave room for growth. If your character is the biggest, baddest, coolest motherfucker on the planet,
Mm-hmm.
all right, what are they doing?
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, where do you go with that?
Yeah.
Are you just going to go through and Hulk smash? Okay, that's great for one session.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have to be, you don't have to know exactly where the character is going and what they're going to end up as, but you have to be able to see possibilities. You have to be able to see several different paths they could go down.
The one thing that I really want to leave with this is when I talk about catharsis, when you're role playing and you also have an understanding of how the dice work, and so you're dice playing and role playing at the same time, that's when you can really have cathartic moments at the table. And those can be very healing, they can be fun. And as long as you've talked to your table mates about being open for that kind of experience, that's something you should do. But what I've found is when you combine the two of them, then that is when you leave a table saying, holy crap, what just happened? That was amazing. And those are the moments I want to leave my players with. And when I'm doing a podcast, that's what I want to leave the listeners with is, holy crap, that was amazing. What just happened? And you need to be able to build those moments in. As a GM, you need to give the opportunity for those moments by opening up your story, but also knowing where you're going. Or where you want to go, rather.
Yeah.
Players might have a different idea. And also as a player, not just dicking around and smashing everything. Having a reason to interact with everything. I'm going into every player that enters a tomb for the first time, every player that enters a dungeon for the first time, it affects them in a different way. Whether they're the farm boy that picked up a sword and now has become the human fighter, or the wizard that left the wizard's college to try and figure out what else is out there in the world. Their first dungeon is going to affect them. Their second, their third, their fourth. And so if you're open to that, then it'll lead to personal character growth as well.
Yeah. My favorite story for character growth has to do with Charles Gravyboat Barnes, my character in Quid Pro Roll. Like, I built him as this like really aggressive libertarian who was all about personal responsibility and government shouldn't be getting involved in stuff the government shouldn't be getting involved of. But over the course of several years of him traveling around and seeing people being downtrodden, seeing nobility, because when the first time he traveled the world, it was as a fairly well-known and well-to-do wrestler. So he wasn't seeing everything. And he's like seeing how people are being mistreated by the feudal lords and stuff like that. And there was one episode where he just all of a sudden realized that the nobility needs to be like paying for schools for these people and teaching them to read. And it was, for the audience, it was like a holy shit, what a slow burn sort of revelation that happened there. But it's exactly what we're talking about. And it didn't even happen intentionally. I just sort of like got there with it. And then I realized that's where it had to go. And Alex and I didn't talk about it ahead of time or anything, but like on the Zoom call when we were recording it, like you could like see several of the other players and Alex realizing what was happening. And she immediately pivoted and just started leaning into it. And all of a sudden, Gravy Boat became very, very pro public funding for a lot of stuff. As long as it's for the betterment of people. But that's what we're talking about, is like, I didn't know that's where, when we started that recording session, I didn't know that's where it was going to take us. And no dice rolls dictated that whatsoever. It was just purely interaction with the people and the environment.
Yeah, and I will say that your dice rolls got you there through hook or crook eventually. So they are an inherently important part of the experience, but your role-playing ability is what allowed that to happen. Yeah. So that's awesome, dude.
Yeah. No, if I never record another podcast ever again, that'll be something that I'm very proud of, is that I saw the opportunity for that and I was able to just run with it.
Well, then let's get you on the Forgotten Path podcast where we have catharsis all the time.
Yeah. We'll see when I've got an opening in my schedule sometime. Sometime after the next 3 weeks when I finish grad school, finally.
All right, Josh.
Yeah. But in case you didn't catch it, Noah Downs, among many other things, has the Forgotten Paths podcast that he says you should download. I've never listened to it, so I don't know.
If you download every episode right now, even if you don't listen to it, you've done me a huge favor. Like, just do it.
Yeah. Is there, on God's earth, is there anything else that you need to promote right now?
I'm going to be at Gen Con, co-sponsoring a party with Hunters Entertainment. And so if you're at Gen Con, make sure you say hello. And other than that, I'm a lawyer. So, like, law things, you can find me on Twitch, Twitter, and TikTok at my lawyer friend, and also on Instagram, my.lawyerfriend.
Yeah, and I will point out that the two things that Noah didn't point out this time. Number one is that he may be a lawyer, but he's not your lawyer. And number two is
didn't give legal advice.
Yeah. And number two is that he's a lawyer, but he's a cool lawyer.
I was trying not to. I was trying to save you. Oh, thank you, my friend.
It's fine.
I'm glad you didn't forget.
Everybody's got their own personal branding and marketing, and all of us are responsible for each other, helping each other out. But Noah mentioned Gen Con. Josh will also be at Gen Con poking around. You'll probably, if you find Josh in a lot of situations, you'll find Noah as well, because they'll be doing some hanging out. And the other things that I typically like to mention, sign up for our monthly email newsletter, where I spend a couple hours a month writing really interesting news about the tabletop industry and pointing you to it in case you didn't know about it. Recommend some cool indie games like I think it's City of Six Moons, which is a great little indie game that I finally was able to order. People who listen to the last couple of episodes know that I've been struggling to get a copy of that because they went out of stock because they get their wooden pieces from Germany and the German factory was out of them. But it's on the way. It cost me $30 and it's on the way. And Alon and I are looking very much forward to playing it.
Good.
So yeah, sign up for the Goblins and Growlers Gazette newsletter down there in the show notes, and it's on our link tree, linktr.ee at Goblins and Growlers. Quid Pro Roll mentioned it a couple times. Also, 5-star reviews are great. Word of mouth is not only the greatest Ludicrous album, but also the best way to let people know about the podcast and grow our audience. So please telephone, telegraph, tell a friend about the Goblins and Growlers podcast. And
I got something to add on to that for you. If you enjoy the Goblins and Growlers podcast, make sure you tell your friends, and if you don't, tell your enemies.
Yeah. And if you don't want to give us please give us a 5-star review. If you want to give us anything less than a 5-star review, please don't, and please reach out to us, and we'll try and convince you to give us that 5-star review.
That's bribery.
No, I didn't say I was going to pay them. I was going to give them a bulleted list of all the reasons why we're worth a 5-star review.
Oh, good. Okay, that's fine. That's acceptable.
Yeah. And also subscribe to the YouTube channel. But I think that's all I got right now. I'm sure Josh will chastise me for forgetting something, because I know I did. But anyway, thank you to Noah for bailing us out this time. Everybody send some positive wishes to Josh that he's up and about before he has to, drive 10 hours to Gen Con. And... and
bro, fly.
Yeah. Yeah. Do something. But we'll catch everybody next time. Hopefully Josh will be feeling better by then. But thanks, everybody, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.
If you like what you hear, consider subscribing and giving us a review over on Apple Podcasts. Especially early in the feed, subscriptions and reviews are super helpful for bringing new listeners our way. Thank you.
Can I refer to Scott? Is it okay if I talk about Scott, the producer? I forget.
Yeah, we mentioned him.
Cool,
it's not a state secret that
good
Scott does this. And we've actually talked about many of Scott's complaints about the podcast on podcast, where he's like, you guys need to stop jawing so much about stupid, unrelated shit at the beginning of the podcast. Because that'll be our post roll. That'll be our post roll.
That's great.
But all right, in 5, 4, 3, 2,